Greetings, everybody. We are live for another fantastic episode of the show this evening. We'll give everybody just a moment to come online with us, as we tend to do. It takes a minute or so. While we're waiting, while we're getting prepared for that, we had a couple of Skype technical difficulties today, but we got it ironed out. So I'll introduce Heyra here in a moment, but yeah, I've got notes here. I've got plenty of notes. I got a lot of questions for her today because I'm super excited, as I said, muy emocionada to have her on, because what an amazing story that she has. So we're going to learn more about it here in a second. We've got a couple of folks coming on with us now, which is we appreciate that. Look, if you all would be so kind as to share this, of course, it's also the archive is being posted to my YouTube channel. Derek Bauman, you should be able to find me on there. Please give us a subscribe. You can go back and see all the shows that are on there if you missed them, caught bits and pieces. But again, if you hit the share button, that would be cool. And follow me as well. And we've got a great lineup all this week. We've got some super cool stuff to look forward to. But as folks are coming on here, Heyra, welcome, bienvenido al programa. Folks, I've spent the most of the last 3 winters in the country of Colombia. I've traveled quite a bit in Latin America, so tengo mucho amor en mi corazón para todo mi gente latino. Me gusta la cultura, la comida, las bebidas, la música, mi reggaetón, por supuesto. And entonces, it's super exciting to have you here and welcome you to the show, Heyra. We want to hear the backstory, the background of how you came here. Your family came here from Mexico when you were 4, and just that whole process and how that went for you. And of course, we have a lot of folks in this situation, right? A lot of immigrants, but you have not only that, but kind of adopted and embraced not only the United States, but our immigrant population, and have become such an outspoken and vocal advocate and activist. You've been all over the media talking about DACA here in Cincinnati Magazine profile, and nationally in the New York Times and in other media. So we want to hear all about that, where this stands today, what that process is like, and maybe where we go from here. So with that, bienvenido, welcome, Heyra Avila, to the show. Thank you for being here and joining us tonight.
Oh, sí, de nada. Do you want me to say it in Spanish or English? I can do both, sir.
We probably better stick to English for most of us. But how was my Spanish there? If you were going to grade me, la profesora, what would I get on my Spanish there?
I mean, I'd give it a solid A.
Yeah? Ooh.
Not A+, just like a solid A.
All right. Well, I gotta have something to strive for. So that's cool. I got an A. Everybody, listen to that. So anyway, yeah. Kick it off. Tell us like how it all started, where it all began. Start from the beginning.
Well, I was born in Veracruz, Mexico, and that's where my parents are from. So when I was born, it's kind of a sad story, but not a story that is uncommon back in my home country and other Latin American countries. So when I was born, we were really, really poor. And so that's not the kind of life my dad wanted to give us, right? So he decided to come to the United States because there were more opportunities here in the States. And so then my mom joined him. But as I mentioned, since we didn't have money, we couldn't get visas, and we didn't have the time to wait the years that is the waiting for visas to come into the country, because we were really starving to death. So we were faced with a decision to save our lives. But to save our lives, we had to risk our lives by crossing the border. So my dad came to the United States. Then I mentioned my mom joined him, and then finally they went back to Mexico to get me, and then we crossed the border undocumented when I was 4 years old, which was about 20 something years ago. Which is a long
20
time.
something. So let me interrupt you right there. How much, so you were super young. You came here when you were 4. How much do you remember of Veracruz and of the trip in that process and what that looked like? Do you remember any of it?
I remember snippets of my little village that I lived in, well, that my grandparents lived in, my mom's side of the family, and I remember crossing the border just a little bit. So when we crossed, my mom was one of the few women, and I was the only child that crossed. So we crossed the desert, and I remember we had to hide at night. And there was a car that was with us, and I remember having the privilege of sleeping in the car with my mom instead of the desert floor. So that was a privilege that we had instead of having to sleep on the desert. And I remember when I first got to Kentucky, not when I crossed the border. So I remember
Well,
I
hold on. Let me
saw the
stop you right
apartment.
there. I'm super interested in this because this is the first time I've had a conversation like this, and it's just so interesting. It's just so interesting to me. So bear with me on this. How do you remember how long that was? Like how arduous was the journey? And of course, different people have different experiences. Some are luckier than others. We know the dangers that are involved. We've seen that, that from criminals. We know there's all kinds of terrible things that happen to people along the route because you're very vulnerable, right? And at the border, there are people that will take advantage, of the folks making this journey in various different and probably ways that most of us would care not maybe not to even know about. But what do you remember of the trip and that that the whole process? How long was it? What was it like? Do you have any specific memories or things that your parents have told you about?
I remember feeling safe with my parents, and my parents said the same thing. This was before 9/11 happened. So, 20 years ago, the border situation was way different than it is now. I know of people that have come recently or even in the past decade, and it's a world of difference. It is just drastically different. I mean, Border Patrol was still existing, like we still had to, be on the lookout in case Border Patrol were to get us. And there was a scare where we thought they were going to catch us. But I remember being pretty safe. I mean, I was a child, so to me it was just like an adventure, with my mom and dad after not seeing them for so long since they were in the United States and I was in Mexico. So I knew that something big was happening, that we were about to embark in a whole new journey, adventure. I mean, I didn't know
Right.
that it was going to last this long and that we were still going to be here today, but here we are.
Well, and so that's amazing, and of course we're glad that you made it. Your family made it. Your parents had actually come to the United States. You had other family here in this area in the Cincinnati region, northern Kentucky, and so they were here for a while and kind of got things settled for you, right? And then went back and then brought you, and that's the process. So after 4, you're here, and then you start school. Now I'm guessing that your parents, at least at the time, spoke no English probably. And so how was that process for you? Let's talk about the language process a little bit because I've experienced that in learning. In learning Spanish. So I had 3 years in high school, which gave me a little bit of a foundation. But spending most, like I said, of the last 3 winters in the country of Colombia, which I'm wearing their jersey today, very proud of that. It's completely different when you're immersed in it, and that learning process. I think it's easier for kids when their brains are kind of still in formation. That learning process, but how did that how did that go? Did you learn that at home at all, or was it when you were in school? And your acclimation process, how did that go, especially with the language? Are you there? We might have a bad. Okay, I think we're back. We had a little Wi-Fi hiccup there, I think. But
I was really even when I communicated my help. Can you hear?
yeah, I think the Wi-Fi was getting
Hello?
a little bit choppy there. But I think you're back now.
Okay. So, other thing, I started preschool here in the United States, and I got pretty fluent by the time I was in first, second grade. So it didn't take me much. I learned pretty quickly. Children learn pretty quickly, but I didn't get help from my parents because they didn't know English. So I kind of just had to learn on my own as I was in school. And I don't think I have an accent when I speak English. I mean, if anything, my Kentucky accent comes out sometimes, but I think that's the only accent I have.
Yeah, no, you don't have much of an accent. You don't have much of an accent at all. So tell us about that. You're going to school, public schools in Northern Kentucky, and how was that? And you mentioned, that was kind of a different time. That could be good or that could be bad. In our current political scenario with 45 up there, creating hostilities for, a lot of folks. I feel like we've regressed a little bit, but you can, we'll get up to today and you tell me a little bit about that. But how was it at that time, 20 some years ago? And how were you accepted? Did you have challenges in school? How did that go for you?
Well, I was different. I was the only one of the very few brown children at the school. So we were just kind of seen, like my family was kind of seen as special, almost like people were curious, way different than now where people are almost hostile, if you're different. So back then it was kind of like, oh, interesting, we'd never seen someone of your kind before, it was almost like that. So we did receive a lot of questions. I remember my peers being curious as to where I was from. And I mean, I was visibly different. I have darker skin, darker hair, just a darker complexion altogether, and I spoke a different language. So naturally there were questions, but I never took them as hostile. I mean, I went through the Kentucky public school education, and I know that people have horror stories, all over Kentucky being in public education, or just, living in Kentucky in general as a brown person. But I think I've always been very lucky or blessed to not get any hate, and if I do, I just let it slide off of me. I think that's the way my mother raised me, to not take anything really to heart. And I always knew I was different. It became challenging around the time when I was in fifth grade when my parents started realizing that people, were curious. I think innocently curious about where I was from. But my mom made sure to tell me to not tell anybody where I was from. And so that's kind of where my mindset shifted as to why not. And I was always a very curious child. So I feel like that's the reason why I got started in activism at such an early age, is because I started questioning things.
Got you. And we've got a couple questions, and let me just let everybody know. Please feel free to drop a comment or question in the comments. If you have one, we'll be happy to get to those to the extent that we can. We're going to talk about DACA a little bit coming up, and so we have a question from Lynn who's asking about how many DACA folks are there in the Cincinnati area. If you know that, if you have that information, but tell us about how that was for you, for your family. Was there just this constant fear? At what point, maybe in your teens or whenever it was that you came to realize this, and when you were traveling, the last thing you want to do was get pulled over probably, and stuff like that. And of course, most folks that are on here, of my friends, but perhaps some new listeners or people tuning in, don't know I was a police officer for a long time, and most of the time in the city of Mason. And so you would, in my career, I ran into undocumented folks, and a lot of times it was because something happened while they were driving. And that, of course, one of my passions around here is supporting public transportation, because we have many folks, be they citizens or be they undocumented folks, that rely on other modes of transportation, but we have this scenario where the reality is to get to jobs around here, you have to drive, and so you're kind of forced. You're kind of forced into that. So, was there the sense of fear? Was it, am I on target with that? That driving was a concern for your family, and how did that really manifest itself?
Yeah, there has always been the fear, and like as an immigrant, as an undocumented immigrant in the Midwest, you face different issues and different problems than if you were in bigger cities like New York, Los Angeles, because in bigger cities we rely on public transportation a lot. In the Midwest, in Kentucky, Ohio, Illinois, you have to have a car to get around. You just have to have one. So when we first arrived in the United States, we walked everywhere. So we lived in an apartment complex, which was walking distance from a little grocery store, and we would walk there. We would walk back to our groceries. My parents worked at walking distance, and so we walked everywhere those first couple months, and until finally my parents were able to get a car. And the fact of the matter is that you need a car to get around, and undocumented people have jobs and they have to get to those jobs. So a lot of the times we're forced to drive without a license. And yeah, when we get pulled over, that's definitely an issue because there's no license that they can provide, no valid license. There's international license, or their Mexican license, but of course that's not valid in the U.S. So yeah, it's very scary knowing that an undocumented person, my parents included, can get pulled over, for having a tail light out and get asked for their ID, which is something that people who have licenses, they take for granted. You don't think twice, just license and registration. But when you don't have one, that is very scary. So yeah, I mean, even I had to drive without a license when I was younger because I had to get a job. I had to drive myself to that job, and
Right.
It wasn't until I got DACA that I was able to get my license that I was able to drive legally. But it was scary, and it's still scary.
Well, and that's a challenge, quite frankly. And you mentioned walking and walkability, another one of the issues that I'm passionate about, making this safe for people get from point A to point B, no matter what mode of transportation that they rely upon. But we have, folks that don't have licenses for any number of reasons and are forced into this because if you, as you mentioned, if you want to get to work, you have to be able to do that. But just kind of moving forward from that, because you are such a passionate I say advocate and activist, because advocates talk about stuff and activists get stuff done, and if you can merge the two of those, that's probably a good place to be. What was it in high school? When did you start getting your real passion for helping people, particularly immigrants, but others of the less fortunate among us, and then you become such a strong voice in the community in that regard. How did that come about that you just really got passionate and engaged on these issues?
I think in middle school. So I was around 13 years old when I really started doing activism work. And I think about it now, I don't know what I was thinking or what my parents were thinking in letting me do this when I was 13 years old. But as I mentioned, I was a very curious child, and so I started asking a lot of questions around fifth grade. So I knew that I was different, visibly, but I also knew that my family was different, and I knew that I didn't have a social security number. I didn't know how many digits a social security number had or what its purpose was, so I didn't have one. So I started learning a bunch of things and acquiring knowledge that at the moment didn't mean much specifically, but I knew that it meant that I couldn't have the same future as my peers. And so I was always really involved in school. I mean, ever since I became fluent in English, humble brag, I was involved in a lot of extracurricular activities. I was involved in a lot of leadership activities. And by the time I was in second grade up through the time I graduated high school and further, I was always involved and I guess pinpointed as a leader and in elected positions and just a bunch of activities I would do. So I guess I would say I was a natural born leader, and so that kind of helped me in this newfound passion for immigrant rights. And of course, it's something that affects my family and myself. So I just kept asking more and more questions, and I just didn't think it was right. And I wanted to have the same future, a bright future with so many possibilities for myself. I didn't want to limit my possibilities because I didn't have a piece of paper, because I wasn't born here. So I started speaking out, sharing my story. So that's what I do the most, is I share my story publicly. So when I was 13 years old, I shared my story for the first time. It was about 30 seconds long, and it was in Spanish, and it's pretty awful. But, thinking back now, it's pretty crazy that I did that and that my parents didn't let me. And of course, there was that fear. It took them a while to get acclimated and to get used to this newfound passion that I had, because even to this day, anything can happen. Like even in this live stream, someone can hear me and, verbally attack me or try to find, there's endless possibilities that can happen, especially as a visible target, as someone that looks different. But, I'm still here, and I'm a pretty fearless spokesperson. I'm not afraid. I realize that I'm blessed and lucky to even be able to speak to you today or about this, because so many people live in fear.
Right.
So many people aren't able to speak out. And so because I started at a young age, I kind of grew accustomed to it, and I love sharing my story. But I know that I need to be careful, and others do too, because there's still that risk that we run every single day until the laws change.
So you bring up some great points. So let's kind of fast forward and talk about that, 2012 timeframe, where with DACA you have the opportunity to become legal, basically, to become documented, to have to get the things that you mentioned, the social security number, a driver's license, things that most of us take for granted and we don't realize. And again, kind of tying that into my own experience, it's a little bit different when you're on vacation or something, or if you're going to somewhere and you're at a resort or a hotel and you're not really there. But when you're actually spending time with the people in the culture, and kind of learning the ways and the processes, and you see the challenges and the difficulties, which I had, and other folks that are perhaps expats or something else, for example, in Colombia, to get a cell phone, to get a cable or electricity at the apartment. You have to have the ID. To have the ID, you have to have a visa, not just a tourist stamp. There's all of these hurdles, even to be there for some period of time. Getting health care, for the system to recognize you. And then if you're actually living there, it's even more of a challenge, obviously. So in 2012 with DACA, take us through that time and what that meant to you, what that process was like.
Well, by the time DACA rolled around, I already had a good number of years and experience with activism. So I can say that I worked with folks who really pushed hard and who really did everything they could to make sure something happened. This DACA wasn't the ideal solution. It was kind of like a Band-Aid and a temporary fix, as we can see now that DACA was rescinded. So when DACA rolled around, I was in high school, and I kind of had to sit down with my parents and had to have a difficult conversation of what it would mean to give all my information to the government. Because one day they might use it against me, or one day they could take it away and come look for us. We talked about that, just as we had to talk about difficult conversations in the past of what would we do if my dad was detained and deported, or if my mom was detained and deported, or if I were detained and deported, not a casual family dinner talk, right? So we've always had to have these difficult conversations, and I'm a part of what you call a mixed status family. So I have DACA, my parents are documented, and my siblings are citizens. So there are a lot of problems that arise with mixed status families and difficult conversations you have to have. But we decided, as a family, that it was worth the risk at the time to apply for DACA. We didn't know how long it was going to last. We didn't know, what the future for DACA was going to hold. We just knew that this was an opportunity that we had to take in the moment, that it was worth taking the risk. And, I think it lasted a good amount of years. I'm honestly surprised it lasted this long. To a certain point, I didn't want to last this long because I want something better. DACA is just a temporary solution, and we need legislation. DACA is not law. So we're still working very hard to try to get something passed that wouldn't compromise our safety or the safety of other folks that are still undocumented.
And for people that don't understand exactly what that means, basically it's for recognizing the right of young people that were brought here as children by their parents, undocumented, but with the concept being, if you've grown up here, if this is all you've known all your life, this is really, this is your country. Is that how you see it? Because if for whatever reason you went back to Mexico, that's not where you grew up. It's your heritage, but it's not what you've known for all of your adult life and most of your childhood. And so we've seen the scenarios where people are deported, and it's like, oh my God, what am I going to do? It's like a foreign land to me because I came here when I was so young, and now I have to go back. But I'm not really from there. I'm from here. Um, can you help us understand that a little bit more and what exactly that means?
Yeah, there's the saying in Spanish, I don't know if you've heard it before, but it says, no soy de aquí ni de allá. I'm not from here nor there.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of the times that's how immigrants feel, especially undocumented immigrants who have been here basically their whole lives. And I know that if I were to go back to Mexico or sent back, against my will, I would feel like I wouldn't belong. And here I feel like I don't belong. So it's almost like an identity crisis that you go through with the combination of cultures. When you talk to your family back home, things are so different, but as you try to keep the culture alive, but some cultural traits are toxic and you don't want to keep those traits. And so there's so many things that affect that identity. And honestly, I did go through an identity crisis when I was a teenager because I wanted to fit in, like any teenager wants to fit in, and I couldn't. I was brown, and I didn't like my skin because I wanted to be white. And that's something that I had to work really hard to get past, to accept myself as I am, to know that brown is beautiful. And I know that there are still teenagers and kids out there that are ashamed or embarrassed of being brown or being different. And that hurts my heart because I know that I was there. And so that affects a child's psyche, it affects the way they see themselves and the way that they think of themselves, and they limit themselves so much. And I was very lucky to have my mom that always told me, you're beautiful, we're different, and we're special. And I have a little brother who also went through that. Okay.
Yeah, you're back. You froze up for just a second, but now you're back with us.
Sorry.
No, it's all good. So you were talking about your little brother.
Yeah, so compared to when I was in elementary school, there has been a significant increase in foreign population, not just Latino population. So there are a significant number of brown kids now at the elementary school that I went to, but we're still not the majority, right? And so we're still seen as different. So I get to have those conversations with my siblings, with my little sisters, with my little brother, to remind them that our culture is beautiful, to remind them that brown is beautiful, and to remind them that it's not bad, that we're different, that we're from a different country. And I want them to really appreciate their culture, our culture, and I don't want them to lose that, especially not the language, because I know that can be very valuable. So that's what I try to do as much as I can.
No, that's amazing stuff, and very heartfelt, and I appreciate you, just openly sharing all this. It's very personal. I think it's important for us to remember, especially here in Cincinnati, a city that was built by immigrants. Basically, I'm in the Over the Rhine neighborhood right now, built by Germans in the mid 1800s who had their own neighborhood here because they weren't welcome downtown in the central business district. Where non-immigrants were, and whatever the different groups were at that time. But we have such, a terrible history in this country, from slavery to how we've treated, any number of immigrant populations over the years. In World War I here, we had the anti-German hysteria where, the streets were renamed and all this type of stuff. We know about the treatments of the Japanese Americans during World War II, and you can kind of just go on and on in this sordid history that we've had in the United States. So, I would remind folks that, the way Hispanic people are treated today, and they have been here for for generations, and now we've kind of seen this layer under 45. We've seen these layers peeled back, where now, people are emboldened to just let their racism run rampant, and we've seen any number of examples. Have you been, what's it like? You're in northern Kentucky, but in the Cincinnati area, and I guess you don't have to, if you're not comfortable talking about it, but, in terms of personal experiences or just crazy people saying crazy stuff to you, does it happen quite a bit? Not that often, have you ever, really felt in fear because, people are attacked in different ways, be it verbally, physically, or what have you?
Personally, myself, no. Luckily, I fear more for my parents, for sure. I know that when election season came up the first time around, and now this time around, whenever I see MAGA hats or Trump 2020 stickers, I cringe a little bit. And depending on the day, sometimes it affects me more than other days. We all have days where we're feeling a little bit down and discouraged, and when I see that just makes me feel worse, honestly. And it's just so aggravating, and I try not to judge, maybe they're good people, right? But just if they support someone that bashes people of color, if they support someone that is in office and says all these vulgar things about women, it just speaks volumes about a person if they're willing to support someone like that. So I feel personally attacked to a certain point, but I've never been verbally personally attacked by someone I know. I have friends who have parents who have been, so like I said, I fear more for my parents, especially because they don't speak English that well. And if someone were to say something to me, I can quickly defend myself, right? So I am a little bit more defensive when I'm out shopping with my parents, or when I'm in situations with them, or whenever I have to deal with like insurance or bills. I'm always the one who has had to kind of take the lead on that from such a young age. So I get a little bit more defensive. And I know that people want to take advantage of people of color, especially if they don't speak the language.
Right. Sorry, it's just powerful stuff when you really think about it, let that stuff sink in. Lynn has another question about, who all kind of falls under or did fall under, and tell us, what your status is now in terms of you're able to renew that. What's that process look like? And was that specifically for, for people from Latin America? Other countries you're coming here not necessarily having to fall under that, or did that cover everybody?
It's not just for Latin American folks. It's for any person who, DACA is for any person who entered the U.S. before they were 16, or also something that a lot of people don't know is you can become undocumented by overstaying your tourist visa. Mm-hmm. So a lot of the times people think that you can only become undocumented by crossing the border, which of course, limits to certain countries. But you can overstay your visa. So I know people from India, from China, from Ireland, who are undocumented or who have DACA now because they overstayed their visas, for whatever reason. I have friends from Colombia who overstayed their visas and they were undocumented and now have DACA. So yeah, it's for any person who then was a child, but they had to have been in the United States before they were 16. They had to have been here for 5 consecutive years. They had to have been here when Obama issued that memorandum. I think it was June or July 2012. And so there are certain requirements. There was an age cap, an age limit, and when DACA was rescinded, that canceled all new applicants. So you couldn't age into it. So if you had DACA when this administration rescinded it, you were safe to reapply. But I know some people that were rejected for unknown reasons. And I know also people who had even been deported with DACA. I've heard of stories of even citizens being deported. So, you want to think that DACA is a protection, but in reality, if there is an ICE raid at any place where a DACA recipient could be, they could be rounded up and, not be given their rights. So you want to think of it as a protection, but when it comes down to it, it's not much. I mean, it does give us a lot of privilege, right? But at the end of the day, it's not enough, and that's the issue.
And it can be rescinded, at any time, basically. And so, you recently went through the process of renewing that. Were you? I can imagine the just you're on pins and needles, right? Walking on eggshells, waiting, hoping your fingers are crossed. Waiting on that, and then you finally got some good news here just recently, right? What's that process now for those?
Yeah.
You're kind of grandfathered in, under that, so we're not taking new applicants now. Hopefully we can fix that and make it better in the future. But what's that like for you and for those that are grandfathered in that renewal process?
It's still a little nerve-wracking because you can still get rejected. Like, just because you've had it before doesn't mean you're 100% guaranteed to have it again. And in, the activist circle, we've been told and are telling people to apply as soon as possible because for the same reason we don't know when it's going to end. So you have to renew it every 2 years. So mine, it was due to expire this August or September, but I wanted to renew ahead of time because anything could happen. So I didn't want to run the risk of waiting too long, and I know that it's going to be heard by the Supreme Court any of these weeks, and so that can either negatively affect us or positively affect us, but just to be on the safe side, I wanted to renew now. And as long as I have my previous application, it's pretty easy. Some folks get a lawyer. I've always had the luck to have someone help me out with my application to fill it out, to make sure I fill it out right. But I mean, I have a pretty straightforward case. I've never been arrested. I've never been in trouble with the law. I went through high school. So it's pretty easy for me, but there are some folks who have different situations who may need a little extra help. But yeah, it's $495 every 2 years.
Wow.
But the prices are expected to go up to the 700 range within these next couple of months too. I think they're raising prices for a lot of different visa programs too, or something like that. So I also wanted to apply before the prices went up because it's a pretty hefty price to pay every 2 years.
Well, let's balance the federal budget on the backs of people trying to renew their DACA. I mean, I think that's just my sense is to be punitive. But at any rate, Lynn makes a good follow-up point. She says, the German folks that were here, although we had Japanese internment camps in World War II and basically imprisoned people, American citizens, just because of that. But she makes the point that, the Germans were never asked to go, to return to Germany. I make the point that, we had Ellis Island. We had basically a welcome station built to welcome folks here. Maybe we need a new Ellis Island somewhere down instead of a wall, we need an Ellis Island to actually welcome folks here. But what does this look like now? You know, what should our goals be going forward now that we're up to the current date? You know, we're thankful that you yourself got renewed and others. But you know, it's kind of on pause. I also make the point very clear to people in this election year of 2020, and every election cycle, no matter what it is, you're going to hear politicians and people saying, "This is a critical time. You know, this is the most important election," which they all are important. But I submit to you that this is probably as important an election as, I don't know, as that we've maybe ever had, because of the Supreme Court. Right now, we have a 5-4 conservative majority Supreme Court. It's likely we're propping RBG up, right? We're not letting her go anywhere. But it's likely that we have 1 or 2 more Supreme Court appointments in this next 4-year presidential term. Folks, we could be looking at a 7-2 Supreme Court for the next, and 45 is a point. I don't like to say the name, so I say the number. 45 is appointing, you know, younger people into these roles, these lifetime appointments. So we're going to be in a scenario where we have for 40 or 50 years in this country a 7-2 conservative majority on the Supreme Court. Are you kidding me? And what are the impacts of that, you know, on real people on this issue and many others? It doesn't matter if you have, as my friend Neil Kelly says, Bernie Sanders reincarnate as president from now until doomsday. It doesn't matter if you're putting out Green New Deals or coming out of Congress. None of that matters when the courts can overturn Roe. The courts can overturn Obergefell, my neighbor across the hall, that ended up driving the case that led to legalizing gay marriage in the United States. Immigration issues, I mean, you name all the stuff that has real impacts on real people on a daily basis is what is at stake here in this election cycle. So, having said all that, that's my rant. Having said all that, what can we do when you're talking about, when we see with, for example, with Obamacare, dismantling healthcare, and now we're in a pandemic crisis, for crying out loud. What can we do in terms of, you know, a DACA plus? What can we do? What would be your goal that you know, that we can advocate for? That we can not only bring DACA back for folks, but make it better in a perfect world. What does that look like?
So before I get started with that, I want to make note for anyone that needs to hear this is that there is no line for me to get behind. There's no office for me as a DACA recipient or my parents as undocumented folks to go apply for citizenship. People think that because you've been here for 20 plus years or for 40 plus, 50 plus years that you are granted automatically citizenship or residency. That's not true. By the mere fact of me as a 4-year-old or my parents at whatever age crossing the border without inspection, that's a technical term, undocumented without inspection, we are barred from having any type of citizenship status. So I just wanted to make that note loud and clear because a lot of people still think that it's so easy for me to just apply. Oh, you bring your salon, just go apply. There's no office for me to go to, there's no application for me to fill out because I was undocumented. And DACA has no pathway to citizenship. So I would definitely start there. In a perfect world, I would definitely have a DACA-like legislation that would lead to a pathway to citizenship that would include more people, that there wouldn't be an age cap, and something that was in the talks a couple of years ago after DACA was DAPA, which would include protection for the parents of DACA recipients. So I think that that would be helpful too. I think we need a pathway to citizenship with no strings attached. So I don't know how many of you have heard the term Clean Dream Act, but a Dream Act is kind of like a DACA plus, if you want to call it that, but it had a pathway to citizenship. But when the Dream Act came into the House or Congress, I think it was last year, they wanted to add strings to it basically by saying more border patrol, more wall funding, more ICE raids, and so we didn't want just any Dream Act. We wanted a clean Dream Act. And when I say we, I mean activists and the majority of the immigrant community. So we don't want to pathway to citizenship if it means risking the lives of other undocumented folks. So, because then that just creates a good immigrant, bad immigrant narrative. That's something that's not okay, it's not good. And I personally don't want to reap benefit if my parents are going to suffer. So that would be my solution in a perfect world, is to give a pathway to citizenship to the people that are here, work on border crisis, because these camps that people are in, they're not safe, they're not okay, it's not morally right for children to be separated from their families. So the border issue does need to be addressed. And I think that instead of getting better with this administration, we've been taking a lot of steps back. So not only do we have a lot to fix, but we have a lot to work to get better, a lot to improve. And it is sad that we're going back instead of forward, but I guess that's how it is.
Well, it motivates me anyway, and especially when we see today with social media, everybody's carrying around a camera in their hands with their phones. We see the videos, we know that's what, children in cages, all of this type of stuff. We see how people are treated on the street today. We've had, incidents like Charlottesville and so many others for people of color. And you see how this really racism and just this, some of the deepest, darkest depths of, just the way human beings could treat one another. People just feel, I think, emboldened is a term I use to just be so, just so obvious with it today. But it's really, I think, exposing a lot of things that were there, anyway. But that gives us something to shoot for, and at the end of the day, to me, it's a human rights issue, and it's pretty much as as simple as that. So I don't know. That's kind of a good roadmap. We've been chatting for about 45 minutes now. I could really talk about this topic and share some other experiences of mine in my travels, but we could talk about that more later. Going forward, is there anything else? Of course, you've accomplished so much. You've gone on from, this travel that we talked about, this journey, this voyage, coming here when you were 4 across the Mexican desert, ending up here in, the Cincinnati area, and going on to graduate from college and be just such a voice and a fearless, outspoken advocate. Dynamite, they say, comes in small packages, and that's certainly the case. And that's certainly the case with you. What else do we have to look forward to? What's next? Do you have anything kind of in the works right now? What are some of the organizations you're involved with, other than just kind of the big picture of this, specifically here in the Cincinnati area? And particularly if there are people other than from the political angle of getting people that are concerned about these issues elected. How can we get engaged? What's the best way to get involved?
Well, this answer would be very different if we weren't going through a health crisis. Right now I feel like a lot of organizations and individuals had to kind of put their events and goals on pause for a second while we tend to our neighbors that are sick. So I think right now, the groups I'm a part of, we're really looking to support the immigrant community, the non-English speaking community, because it's affecting our communities. I personally know people who have been infected, who they're just going through a really awful time right now. Economically, they didn't receive a stimulus check because undocumented people or even DACA recipients sometimes a lot of times don't receive federal aid. And in this instance, DACA recipients did receive a stimulus check, but undocumented individuals didn't.
Even though I have to interrupt on that, to that point, because we hear a lot of talk about that. It's one of the talking points from the right, if you will. But you still pay taxes. So in many ways, immigrants add value to our society, performing so much labor, and other things are taken advantage of on the job. And I think this is, one of the passions of mine, among a few that we've mentioned, is our good friends in labor. And we have, working people that are working hard in what we might consider menial jobs, but very hard work. Farming, agriculture, all of this stuff. We've seen the meat packing industry, right? So on the one hand, you have, big business hiring folks, and attracting them here with the jobs, but then taking advantage of them because we know they're not really in a position to report anything or call anybody about it. So there's wage theft. For me, I was up in Mason shortly after I retired, not for police work, but because I was supporting a picket line where some, folks were being taken advantage of on the job up there. And so that's one of the big issues that we see as well. But the kind of the moral of the story, to the point you were making, is you pay taxes, especially payroll taxes and all of these types of things. And so there's so much value there, but a lot of times then it doesn't come back, and we only look at that side of the equation. Am I wrong? Am I wrong on any of that?
No, you're not wrong. We do pay taxes. And for example, like as a DACA recipient, I pay taxes, right? I pay into Social Security, and that is a benefit I will never see, as a DACA recipient. So I help pay into these systems that I will never reap any benefits from. In college, if scholarships are funded by the government or government-funded programs like TRIO, First Generation students, I cannot receive those benefits because it's money from the government and it's only for citizens. And so, now luckily there's more awareness, there are more scholarships and private funding for undocumented students and for DACA students. But as a whole, it's very hard to receive help. And now we're seeing legal immigrants, people who have residency statuses who are seen as a public charge. I don't know if you've heard of that. So if you are not a citizen and you've been receiving government funds for food stamps, for example, you can be denied your renewal because you are seen as a charge to the government and to the economy. So, there's so many things to talk about for days. I'm obviously so very passionate about this issue, and for next steps, I would say keep talking about it, keep bringing awareness. First of all, I personally love sharing my story and I love talking about it, but don't expect any immigrant or any person to have to do the talking always, right? So I personally love doing it, and before all this pandemic, I would go on and do public speaking events, and I had some events planned that had to be canceled, of course. But if anyone listening wants to hear more, wants to talk to me more one-on-one, I love having conversations with people, obviously, right? And I'm always more than willing to come out and, well, not right now, but to maybe talk through Zoom. I'm involved in a lot of groups who have been doing Zoom activities, or, leading into meeting, or, what have you. So that's the first thing, keep raising awareness and uplifting the voices of those people who aren't afraid, and don't expect people who are vulnerable or scared to have to share their story. And second of all, put your money where your mouth is. Donate to organizations that help undocumented folks or who help immigrants, because a lot of the times we donate to big organizations that we don't really know where it goes into. So donate local. I would say there's I know there's a local fund, I can't think of the name of it right now, but it's helping undocumented folks, or donate to funds for DACA renewal fees, and I know that would help a lot. I think there's a couple thousand DACA recipients in the area for sure. The tri-state area. I think the number is 4,000 in Ohio. Last time I checked, I'm not sure, so I wouldn't quote myself on that. There's definitely lots of information out there. And just don't be afraid to speak up, and just know that there are people out there that are willing to share their story, and if there's a seat at the table, then allow them to sit at the table. And sometimes this means giving up your seat at the table. And that's something that people need to know, that we need to include these voices, these stories. You can't just shout for those people, right? So there's a fine line. But I think that society has made a lot of progress, but I think there's still a long way to go. We can always do so much better, and especially helping out Kentucky, because here in Kentucky we need a lot more help too. So, but I think that's a different conversation.
That goes without saying. That goes without saying. But having said that, you are right. I think the city of Cincinnati in particular, Hamilton County as well, but particularly the city of Cincinnati, I think has done a pretty good job enacting some some programs. I know there's a liaison officer in CPD working with the Latino community. And as a matter of fact, I posted a few days ago, and we can go back in the comments here, and if there are any links or anything, we could drop that for a resource, because this will get shared around. People will watch it, after the fact and look at the comments. I know the City of Cincinnati Health Department, to the point about COVID-19, has a Spanish-speaking enferma, a nurse, to help folks that, if you have symptoms, any health problems, but particularly COVID-19 symptoms, to be able to call her and reach out. So maybe we'll do that. I will drop that information in the comments here afterwards. But Heyra, thank you so much for joining me tonight. This has been a great conversation. It's been almost an hour, and it's flown by, because I can talk about this stuff forever. And one thing that I personally want to do is everything in my power, certainly here in the city of Cincinnati, to continue to make this an even more welcoming place for folks, whether it be from Latin America, people of color, and immigrants from around the world, to make Cincinnati a place that they know that they are welcome and that they are safe. So to that extent, I hope that we can continue to work together in the future on more of that, on more of these very important and critical issues. So thank you so much. Again, folks, we'll drop in the comments some additional information for everybody. Remember, Monday through Thursday, for the time being, at least at 7 o'clock, we have a whole slate and lineup of fantastic guests from around Cincinnati and the region, talking about these issues that are so critical. And not only the issues, but the personal stories, their background and their backstory, that kind of gives us some insight into how and why they're so passionate about the issues that they're passionate about. So thank you all for joining us tonight. Please, again, give this a share. Check out the archive on my YouTube, Derek Bauman, at Derek Bauman, Twitter and Instagram. And with that, Heyra, any closing words of wisdom for us? You've had so many tonight. You might be out. I don't know.
I was just going to say thank you, Derek, and thank you to everyone who's listening. And don't be shy, reach out. I think Derek tagged me on Instagram and Twitter. I don't use Twitter much, or Facebook. So just one last thing is, si se puede. Yes, we can, but we need your help, everyone's help. So
I love it. Great stuff. Gracias. Okay, ciao, everybody.
Gracias. Buenas noches.
Buenas.